I've just traveled 8 hours to see the country half my family was from, to visit the places my dad grew up, and to recreate a bicycle trip. One sure sign I've arrived in Holland, the presence of an automat with frites. Now I'm wandering sleep-deprived in the Netherlands' biggest transportation hub, Schiphol Airport. My first task? Catch a train to The Hague. The train station is in the airport, and just as busy. It's packed with people like me trying to figure out how to buy a ticket and for which train. Most of us waited in line to discover the ticket machines wouldn't take our foreign credit or debit cards. Down an escalator, much like a subway, I found trains below ground heading in all directions, including high-speed fire trains going to Brussels at 250 kilometers per hour. There are also two-level commuter trains, like Toronto's GO trains. But in the first hint at Holland's cycling infrastructure, these trains have specially marked doors for cyclists. Eventually I found my train, or at least what I thought was my train, and began the trip 60 kilometers south to The Hague. It turned out that wondering if I was on the right train, bus, or tram was going to be a big part of this trip. After all, lots of trains leave Schiphol, just west of Amsterdam, for every major town in Holland.
I'm on the stop train, which is kind of like a GO train. And it's true that there's frequent trains from the airport to The Hague, but you have to be careful about which one you get on, because some of them make all the stops, and some of them are kind of express. The Snell train is the express. I missed the Snell train, but I think we'll see more this way.
Yet as the stops kept flying by, I began to wonder if I was making an unplanned side trip to Southern Europe. Well, a few tense moments there. I got on a train. I thought it was going to stop at all the stops, but it didn't. And I thought it might sail all the way past to Antwerp. I've stuck my luggage in the machine here and paid with a Visa, and they gave me a little ticket. So now I guess I can wander, and hopefully when I come back I'll be able to get my bag back. So I think what's behind me has to be seen to be believed. Right outside Den Haag HS station, I found the first reminder of Holland's experience during the Second World War, a monument to 12 citizens shot in the last months of the occupation. Next, I planned to wander through the neighborhood south of HS station, to find the address where my dad's family lived when he was born in 1939. Just a few months after that, Holland was invaded and was occupied for 5 years. During the war, many of The Hague's wooded streets were used for mobile launchers firing V-2 missiles at London. Sometimes the missile would fail and fall into the neighborhood, but if it didn't, the street was often attacked by Allied aircraft trying to destroy the launchers before they could be moved into hiding. It looks like number 35 is actually available. If my information is correct, this was my dad's first address, number 33. Right across from a large park. So just behind me is number 33, Jan van Bielstraat. And I think if we turn over this way, we're actually going to get a chance to see the infamous creek, famed in song and story. Now, I might not have all the facts quite right, but the family legend goes something like this. When my dad was 4 or 5 years old, he fell into this small creek across the street, next to the Park den Berg. He wasn't pulled out until it was almost too late. The Hague, like the rest of Holland, is crisscrossed with paths. Footpaths, bike paths, and the LF routes, the long-distance bike paths. They're everywhere. But you need to be on the right one. So you kind of have to make sure you get it right. The red path is for the bicycle. The path beside that is for walking. And of course, the actual roadway is in the middle. And a couple times now I found myself not really paying attention and sort of wandering over onto the red bike path and realizing at the last minute that was a really bad thing to do. I mentioned a bicycle trip. After the war, the family moved to Harderwijk. My dad, sometimes with his brothers Bert and Ed and my grandfather, would bicycle several hours to visit their grandmother in Utrecht. Once, when my dad was about 13, he decided to keep riding, back to The Hague, a distance of about 120 kilometers. He left around noon and arrived unannounced at his grandparents' house on Rodenbachstraat at about 7:30 in the evening. That is the trip I decided I would recreate, in reverse, cycling from The Hague to Harderwijk. So I'm standing in front of number 19, where the original trip ended, and this is pretty much where I'm starting, more or less. So this is where one of the LF routes cuts through the city, and you can kind of see that it's a little more, first of all you got the red signs telling you that it is an LF route, telling you where everything goes, and then you can see it's a little bit more sort of separated from everything else. It's kind of like off by itself. I walked north toward the old center of The Hague, reaching the Grote Markt, an open market square, and stopped for my first real Dutch beer, Hertog Jan, at De Zwarte Ruiter, the Black Rider. I had a few days in the city before my bike ride would start. My hotel was on the waterfront in the seaside neighborhood of Scheveningen. I have always felt the best way to see a town is on foot, so I decided to walk through the streets all the way up to the beaches and dunes on the North Sea. It's called Jantje, but it doesn't look anything like my dad. Right next to a busy street was another reminder of Holland's wartime past. Bunkers built as part of Hitler's Atlantic Wall to stop the Allies from liberating Europe. So it's day one, and I'm here at the quirky little Hotel Corel in The Hague. Just a short walk from the beach, which is where I'm headed next. So I'm off to look at the beach and to look for some fresh seafood. That's all for now. And people are surfing. I'm gonna see if I can hike up to the dunes while there's still some light, which should last until very late in the evening. I think sunset here is supposed to be like 9:40. If you make your way far enough down the beach at Scheveningen past all the commercialized stuff, you'll see the emplacements that were left by the Germans as part of their Atlantic defense. So it's all still here. I began to realize that while I had roots here, I was still a stranger in a strange land. Train schedules posed one problem, the transit system another. It turned out I had arrived just days after a nationwide transit switchover to chip cards.
Sinds 19 mei is uw strippenkaart niet meer geldig.
The old strippen card in use for decades were no longer sold, and no one had much experience yet with the new system.
Niet uit te checken met uw chipkaart.
Luckily, the drivers still took cash at a premium.
Kremerweg. De volgende halte is Laan Kopers van Kattenburg.
I had one more full day in the city before I began riding east. I wanted to see as much as I could.
Centraal Station.
I was trying to gauge what riding would be like. The Hague was a strange new world of traffic, with signals warning of oncoming trams, and gates right on the tracks to prevent cars from entering restricted areas. And like many towns in Holland, the city has a car-free central core. There was more construction than I expected for the medieval center. New towers and renovation of older structures. This would make the first few kilometers of my ride out of town interesting. As I would also soon find out, many Dutch towns have multiple public squares that host festivals and markets. In other words, bicycle obstacle courses. At the city's heart is the Binnenhof. It was built in the 1200s as a hunting lodge and became the Dutch Parliament building in the 1400s. The word Hof describes the courtyard the buildings enclose, which is open to the public. It was strange to walk through a structure seen in paintings from the 1600s. Little did I know my bicycle route the next day would go straight through this historic courtyard.
One good thing about being here in the middle of a weekday is that it's possible to be pretty much the only person around what is a pretty significant historical location. There's a lot of bikes here. It's almost like somebody decided, let's do things differently and make sure that people use bikes instead of cars.
I stopped for my first genuine Dutch fresh herring, which is delicious by the way, and I started to notice how much wildlife, especially waterfowl, was present. I was a bit surprised because Holland in 2011 is the most densely populated country in Europe. Well, not counting Vatican City, at 402 people per square kilometer. India has 368 per square kilometer. This was definitely worth pausing to think about before my next stop. One of my own early memories is flipping through a book of prints by M.C. Escher, the Dutch artist. I think I spent hours wondering what it would be like in the impossible worlds he drew. I couldn't miss visiting the Escher Museum in The Hague.
Another unusually empty spot.
As I wandered, I was watching Dutch cyclists with increasing apprehension. They were taking chances I would never take back home. It was later explained to me that in any accident involving a car and a bicycle, the driver of the car is automatically at fault. I think that makes the cyclists a little braver and the drivers a little more cautious.
Just missed it. So that was kind of a long day of dodging bicycles. It is really interesting though, because there's areas, of course, where the center of the city is actually completely shut off to vehicle traffic. And it's really just you and the bicycles and the bromfiets, which are the scooter kind of motorized bikes. They can go in there. So it's this weird sort of maze of little medieval streets with all this activity going on, but no actual cars. And the weird thing about it is that you kind of notice the absence of the sound of cars is just sort of mostly just people, the sound of people talking, and lots of people today, even during the middle of the day. So it's a kind of a crazy, busy area, but pretty neat to walk around in.
Before this trip, the longest bicycle ride of my life was probably only 30 kilometers. And that was only a few weeks earlier in my increasingly frantic attempts to prepare. I spent hours in the ravines near home, choosing some cold and rainy days so I would know what to expect. I planned to recreate my dad's bike ride, but that was only the beginning. I intended to cycle 300 kilometers over the course of the next 5 days to see as much of the country as I could. And that was going to happen rain or shine. Fortunately, I didn't have to do everything myself. Tulip Cycling is a company in Holland that rents bikes and bicycle gear, plans itineraries, and can book accommodations along the way. Everything I would need, including a GPS preloaded with my route, was delivered to the hotel that morning. I was finally on my way, starting out in one of the city's large wooded areas. Before my trip, I exchanged a series of emails with Peter at Tulip. I told him about my plan, and he had created a route combining my dad's original ride with other points of interest.
Okay, so how many Dutch things can I get in one picture? So there's my first real windmill. And over there, electrified rail. And immediately behind me, canal with a bridge and my bicycle, which is very nice. And over there you can see some ducks, which are not really Dutch per se, but it's kind of cute.
A few days before my flight, Peter wrote to warn me that the first day's ride would be the longest, at about 90 kilometers. I found out later that was the longest single day of riding they had ever planned out. Because all my accommodations were booked, I had to complete each day's planned ride. It wasn't really an option to improvise.
I spotted the post box, so I'm going to mail the postcard. Let's see. There's 2 slots, so I'm just going to take my chances. It's either the Oranje postcode or the other one. Put it in here, hope for the best. So behind me are my first thatched roof houses. That's kind of cool. And on the other side, you can see what looks like kind of approaching rain. The good part is I pretty much have a wicked tailwind that I could almost not pedal all the way to Utrecht. Of course, I think the side effect of that is getting soaked. Share the road! All these houseboats. And it's just pretty crazy. Like, so much of what I've seen so far is sort of impossibly pretty. Or pretty beyond words. This whole route following thing has been a little bit of a trick. I've gone off the course a couple of times.
One good thing about a densely populated country is that there is always somewhere nearby to stop when a downpour starts. Oh, and when you order a coffee here, you always get some little thing to eat on the side. It's very civilized.
These houses have basements? And do they flood? Look, it's another blue Yaris.
25% of the land here is below sea level. 50% is less than 1 meter above. Catastrophic and deadly floods have shaped the country over millennia. I did not expect the surreal yet beautiful landscape that handling this constant threat has produced, with water where it shouldn't be. I was passing through an area with an average elevation of -2 meters. Here, every property is a waterfront property.
It's like being on some crazy bicycle highway. It's beeping at me again. I'm not sure what to do. It's almost 6 p.m. I guess I've been taking it pretty easy today, although it's been going pretty easy. I think I'm over halfway there now. I called the hotel just to make sure that there was no problem and I can get there as late as midnight. I do have lights, but I won't need them until like 10 p.m. and it's not going to go that late.
Or so I thought.
Cycling along this canal, and it's, first of all, kilometer after kilometer of dedicated fietspad, bike path, and one sort of beautiful house after another, old and new. Well, if the sign is to be believed, then I'm almost there.
Almost there is somewhat misleading. The route had quite a few twists and turns, and there was a lot to see. By the time I reached the town of Vorden, the wind had really picked up. Luckily, it was still at my back. I was experiencing firsthand exactly why there were so many windmills in Holland.
This is sort of what I mean by ridiculously pretty. It's ridiculously pretty.
With the sky growing more menacing, I probably should have picked up the pace, but I didn't want to miss anything.
Right now my passport is digging into me. I never knew a passport could be so painful. Well, now it's starting to get late.
I was on a narrow path through the Groene Hart, the Green Heart, a rural area surrounded by major cities.
All they've done is basically taken the space between 2 farmers' fields and turned that into a bicycle path. I think part of the reason the drivers are so
They said they were going to be aggressive, but I didn't experience that. I think that actually all the drivers are also cyclists, and so they tend to have this understanding. Somehow I don't think Peter knew about this. In my correspondence with Peter, I had mentioned one of the addresses I wanted to visit. I discovered he had programmed my route to go right past it. The address was Dorpstraat number 49, where the family business had been for many years. My grandfather was born here in 1913, the year after the Titanic sank, the year before the Great War began. It was strange to be on this street for the first time, almost 100 years later. Well, I got here a bit later than I wanted to, but this is it. And it's been a long ride. It's been a long day. I probably meandered more than I should have. And I probably have another half hour at least before I get to the place in Houghton. So I think I'm going to get on my way. Let's see where it goes from there. When I finally arrived, it was dark and cold and I was soaked. But the hotel was warm and dry. I wonder if bicycle touring might be the closest thing to what travelers on horseback would have felt. You experience the country you pass through with all your senses, instead of racing by in a metal box. That day's ride had been a blast. Even though the last hour and a half was in the rain, and in fact right now I can hear it pouring outside. Tulip Cycling had routed me right through the main courtyard of the Binnenhof, past churches, old windmills, medieval little villages. I'm exhausted. There were so many beautiful things to see. I couldn't just keep stopping. I've gone off the trail a bit today, taking a bit of a chance and trying to navigate on my own. But this morning, and it's still morning, so I think I have time, I'm going to make my way back into Utrecht, and I'm going to use the Knopppunt network. I just had the clever idea that I should take a photo of this map and have it on my camera. So far that strategy seems to be working. I'm here at Knopppunt 72. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. And behind me is Fort Jutpus. I had a handful of old family photos. A few had landmarks I thought I might be able to find. One was particularly intriguing, a picture of my dad and his brothers on a bridge. I knew the bridge must be somewhere between Harderwijk and Old Frieswijk, south of Utrecht. A train was passing behind them, so it had to be on a railway route. I searched online along the tracks between the towns, looking for a bridge like the picture. The caption below the photo suggested it was in Schalkwijk, but I found no bridge in town. Of course, a lot can change in 60 years. The only place that seemed to match was a pair of bridges north of Frieswijk, although it looked like the railway span had since been modernized. So I think this is the railway bridge from the photo. It's pretty much impossible to get into the position where the original photo was taken, because you really get the impression they don't want pedestrian traffic there. Well, I'm about to set out on the second leg. I'm getting a bit of a late start, but I'm sure it'll be fine. I'm lost beside a canal in Amersfoort, but as you can see, there's much worse places to be lost. Winding down these little streets in Amersfoort, and looks like Peter's got me going right past the birthplace of Piet Mondrian. Amersfoort had its 750th birthday in 2009. The medieval center is incredibly well preserved. I found the beauty of old Dutch towns was becoming disturbing. I was reminded that Toronto had been tearing down almost everything that wasn't glass and steel until just a few decades ago.
I'm on a roundabout just for feets. Well, feets and bromfiets. But this is right, pretty much coming into Harderwijk.
The room is trying to communicate with me. I had just finished the same route my dad had taken all those years ago. It had been a great introduction to Holland, but it really was just the beginning. There were a few more days of riding ahead. Today I would bike 36 kilometers south to the small town of Otterlo, at the western entrance to the Hoge Veluwe National Park. First, though, I was going to explore the town where my dad grew up. Every place I stayed had some way of securing the bicycles of guests. After retrieving my bike from the hotel garage, I made my way to the square outside the Grote Kerk. Grote Kerk literally means large church, and almost every town here has one. Like many of the towns I would see in Holland, much of the center of Harderwijk is off limits to vehicle traffic. And like old towns anywhere, instead of a grid, there's a much more organic maze of open cobblestone squares, curving streets, and narrow passageways. And, of course, bicycles everywhere. Wandering through a small walkway, I found myself in the middle of a Saturday market. It seems that buying fish here is a serious business learned at a very early age. It also appeared that Dutch markets involved considerable shouting. There was an unexpected mixture of activity taking place at the same time. A choir was performing in a church just off the square. A culinary tour of Holland probably wouldn't have that many stops, but I finally found one of the things I had been looking for since I arrived. A vendor was baking fresh stroopwafels, and I had only tasted packaged ones back home. The real thing didn't disappoint. It was like a layer of warm sugar between two other layers of warm sugar. I would make it up to my pancreas later. Harderwijk was a saltwater fishing port until massive flood defenses sealed out the North Sea in 1932, changing the economy forever. Now the walled town looks out across a freshwater channel toward land that didn't exist when my grandfather was born. Just south of the town's iconic windmill is the neighborhood where my dad's family lived until they left Holland. This was where my dad's bike ride began. This was their home when my grandfather worked as a chemical engineer in Harderwijk's rubber fabriek. It was where my dad, his brothers, and his sisters had grown up going to school and high school. And of course it was the place from which so many bicycle trips had started, including the one I had just recreated. This wasn't the end of my adventure, but it was a special place. Nearby, I was reminded that each train station seems to have a permanent population of several hundred bikes. The Dutch cycle about 850k per person per year, compared to 75k in Britain and 40k in the US. Yet there are only 1.4 injuries per 100 million k cycled, compared to 6 in Britain and 37 in the US. Meanwhile, the Dutch burn 85 calories a day walking and biking, while the British burn 50 and Americans 20. The obesity rate here is 12%, compared to 34% in the US. Heading southeast out of town, I was looking for an old sanatorium which had been a wooded playground for my dad and his friends. I had begun to think the original buildings had been torn down.
I stand corrected. It seems to be right behind me. So it's still here.
The next leg of my ride was toward Otterlo, a small town on the western edge of the Hoogveluwe National Park. The farms dotting this wooded stretch have a fairy tale feel. Instead of Hansel or Gretel, though, I found some sort of castle with beer. It also had bitterballen, which are deep-fried battered balls of meat, flour, and butter that are far more tasty than that description sounds.
I'm not entirely sure what the deal is here, but it's very pretty.
Higher-end houses like this are scattered over the countryside, but many are no longer private homes.
Well, it's raining and it's a bit cold, but that's fine because it's still very pretty. And I've got my rain shields on, so I'm good to go.
It was going to be another day of riding in the rain, but as you might guess, that doesn't really stop anyone here.
A few minutes ago, I was actually going past some kind of military base that had a barbed wire fence around it, and all sorts of nasty signs, even though they weren't in English. Clearly said no photographs or filming. I actually got screwed up on my route a couple times because I went down a road past the base that wasn't part of my route. I started to imagining being interrogated by Dutch military police to find out what I was doing there.
I even found out later that, like many secret locations around the world, online satellite imagery of this area has been deliberately obscured. As I traveled south toward the national park, the countryside began to change. It seemed a little less wooded and a little more sandy. It turned out that I would not only be riding in the rain, but off-roading in it as well.
Well, Peter's got me going down a little bit of a trail here, and as you can see, I just about nearly wiped out in the sand.
I was once again surprised by Holland's empty spaces.
I'm right in the middle of, well, I could say nothing. It's just a great big expanse of forest that Peter's got me biking through on a trail which is, well, it looks like it's a couple of car ruts, but it seems like there's just no one around. I saw a couple people on the trail a few kilometers back, and that's about it.
After a half hour of fun in the wet sand, I was back on something more solid.
Tarmac!
Once again, it was almost dark by the time I arrived. And an odd coincidence, the hotel rooms had names instead of numbers. I was also alarmed that I was starting to see the same beers on tap. I still had days to go, and I didn't want to recycle. The tiny village of Otterlo seemed deserted on a Sunday morning. As the entry point to a major park, it felt a bit like Banff, Alberta. The Netherlands has 16 million people and 18 million bikes. 500,000 bikes were stolen in 2009. Police are now experimenting with GPS-equipped bait bikes to catch thieves. I wasn't taking any chances. Nevertheless, the national park has 1,700 unlocked white bicycles free for public use. The 55 square kilometer park has 43 kilometers of bike path. The park's sand dunes, left over from the last ice age, look like a never-ending beach. Not all of Holland's treasures are in Amsterdam. In the middle of the park is the Kröller-Müller Museum. Here, among other things, I found ample evidence the Dutch invented hockey.
Yes, more apple tart. How could you resist that?
Despite being a popular recreation spot, the park is home to over 200 deer and 50 wild boar, which are very tasty. Or so I'm told. I was leaving behind the part of Holland in which my family had lived. I had asked Tulip Cycling to suggest a route for my next few days. Peter chose a path through medieval Holland, one day east to Deventer and one day north to Zwolle.
Beer, making stupid ideas seem like good ones for thousands of years. And what are these wild rooster things anyway? As I was saying, people will ride side by side, but you yield whenever there's something oncoming. And pedestrians use the trails as well, but they know that they can just jump to the side when they hear a bike bell. So one of the things I've noticed about Dutch homes is they tend to have very large windows, because as much light as they're getting now this time of year, they get that much less during the winter, so they're trying to bring as much light into the house as possible. And the other thing I've noticed is that nobody has screens, because clearly their bug situation is well under control. And I think it might have something to do with a lot of the things that eat bugs. I'm not entirely sure what this sign says. It has the word explosives. I'm pretty sure what it's telling me is that if you wander down this road, you'll get blown up. It's tragic sometimes to see how some of the peasants live. So this is interesting. This is brand new construction with thatched roof. That's pretty cool. It's a land where goats are king. Just let myself into the B&B Isle Palace. Check out that stove. Let me take you through. This looks like quite the party's been happening here. And then we go up the Harry Potter stairs. Let's go in, shall we? It really is something.
Deventer is old enough to be burned by Vikings in 882, though I'm guessing their anti-Viking wall no longer gets much use. Deventer grew up on a trading road across the River Isle, which made it an economic center. Like Harderwijk, it was part of the Hanseatic League, an alliance of trading towns across northern Europe. In the Middle Ages, the League was almost a state of its own, even waging wars to defend its commercial interests. This past is well preserved in modern Deventer, including a 500-year-old cauldron in which counterfeiters were boiled alive. If that was the punishment for forging a few coins, I wondered what the city's fathers would have done about today's financial crises.
So you can sort of see just by looking at it that the water level does seem to be very, very low.
The river varies with melting snow in the distant Swiss Alps. So even far from the sea, water can still be a problem.
The river routinely overflows its banks and floods the first street or two in the city.
For hundreds of years, the Dutch have considered deliberate flooding a means of defense against invaders. Outside Deventer, I found Cold War bunkers for just that purpose. In the event of a Soviet invasion, huge gates could be opened, allowing the Isle River to flood the countryside. It wasn't clear what the people living in the countryside were supposed to do.
Nice place. Too much gardening to do.
In an odd coincidence, while I was learning about flooding here, I was missing out on some real live flooding in my own house.
Well, that was Holly calling to tell me the pipes had burst at home. There's anything I can do. But maybe I should have another beer. Okay, that's a German beer, not a Dutch one, but what are you gonna do?
This was my last day of riding, following the Isle River north to Zwolle. I didn't know it yet, but following the river was going to mean crossing it a few more times.
Well, this is the latest puzzle from Peter, but it looks like I have to press some kind of a button. It is like a video game in order to summon something to take me across. I'm really hoping that getting across the water doesn't involve that thing somehow.
The white stork had disappeared from Holland by 1991, but is now making a comeback. It prefers nesting close to people, and many cultures consider it good luck. Of course, it also eats rodents like candy, which may explain why these platforms are built. The hotel fitter seemed a bit over the top, but a nice place to end 5 days of riding in the elements. The fitter is actually a set of 4 renovated townhouses, which are designated national monuments. Luckily, this is in Amsterdam, so it doesn't cost a fortune to stay here. A few hours earlier, I had met with Peter from Tulip to return my bike and gear. The cycling part of my adventure was over. The rest of my trip would be by train, bus, and foot. Zwolle has an old fortified center still clearly visible on maps and on the ground. One reason it was still intact when I arrived was a World War II Canadian soldier, Private Leo Major. In April 1945, Canadian artillery was preparing to shell the town before entering it. Major, ordered to conduct nighttime reconnaissance of Zwolle, instead ran through its streets, engaging its occupiers. The enemy, convinced the entire Canadian army had arrived, fled, and the barrage was called off. For this action, Major was awarded the Distinguished Conduct Medal. He received it again during the Korean War and is the only Canadian to be awarded it twice. Every school kid in Zwolle knows the name Leo Major, the guy who liberated their town single-handedly.
It's raining.
Kampen would be my last medieval town before Amsterdam, and I only had time for a brief visit. This was another Hanseatic city locked in a struggle with water. Kampen's fortunes had declined as the IJssel silted up. Only in the 1800s, when engineers dammed some river deltas, did the faster IJssel become a viable trade route once again. It was strange to no longer have a bicycle at my disposal. My world felt just a little smaller. When I finally arrived in Amsterdam after more railway comedy, it was almost midnight. I was staying in a small but nice closet overlooking a canal, a short walk from Central Station.
That's a lot of bugs. Some of these buildings look a bit melty. The Palace of Justice. Now I know what you're probably thinking. That's where I have to go. But it's not. I'll show you.
The IJ Brewery is a small, not-to-be-missed brewer of Dutch craft beers. They have a tasty range of brews and a crowd lined up to drink them. They also have the biggest bottle collection this side of your uncle's basement.
I think this might actually be Van Gogh's bicycle.
Walking the canals in the fading light, I looked back on my 5 days of riding. Cycling here had given me a new perspective on traveling, and 300k now seemed not so far after all. Each day brought a new challenge and another adventure. Even riding through the pouring rain had been exhilarating. I hadn't known what to expect when I arrived, but now part of me didn't want to leave. I knew I would be back.